Okay, we're gonna start real because it's time. I don't want to rob you of your time with these two awesome ladies. So you have a lot of traveling school admin here tonight because this is our first annual living room learning session, and we're so psyched about it. And I just really want to thank Chrissy and Gabby for being here and doing this for us. There's so many people excited about it, and thank all of you participants who are jumping in with 2 feet, and we really appreciate it. And really a ton of thanks to Maddie and Laura, who really made this happen. It was this cool idea that's actually happening. So thank you all for being here. Take it away, Maddie.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to launch this series and continue learning with you all, even though the global pandemic and all that surrounds that climate has forced us to innovate a little bit with our programming. So we're lucky that this has allowed, seems like, students and teachers and folks who have yet to be in a traditional traveling school classroom setting to come together and learn from these wise young ladies, or young women, sorry, who are going to engage us in some really rich discussion about how to acquire skills to impact positive change in this world, which I think is the most relevant conversation we could be and should be having right now. And I'm just so grateful for this amazing group of participants to make that conversation even more rich and robust. So thank you all for being here. We're excited to innovate together. And while we would love to be in Southern Africa right now, learning science amongst the elephants and on a safari vehicle, etc., it's really amazing that we can use technology to come together in this way as well. So without further ado, I would love for Chrissy and Gabby to introduce themselves and maybe just briefly chat about your connection to the traveling school and introduce this lovely lecture that you've curated for us.
Absolutely. I guess I'll start. My name's Gabby. I was a teacher. I taught math and I taught Spanish and global studies on TTS 31 and TTS 33 in South America. And prior coming to the traveling school, I was in the graduate school program of international education at NYU, which is where I met Chrissy. And she and I started talking a lot about our previous experiences traveling together and the kinds of conversations that you have in like talking about international development. And we ended up co-teaching a class together called International Human Rights Education and Activism in the fall of 2016. So it was really an amazing bridge for her to mentor me in that time and then really introduce me to this whole world of global education and to get into semester programs like the traveling school. And since then, I've started teaching history, and I was living in Chile before the pandemic broke out, so I still miss it, but I'm really happy to be back in this space.
Thanks, Gabby.
My name is Chrissie Monahan. As Gabby said, we taught together at NYU, but before that, what started me on the road that I've traveled for the past 10 years was working for the traveling school in 2009 and 2011. And in who I was working with and the work that we were doing, I thought a lot and was kind of inspired and challenged to think a lot about real world issues and what is required to address them. And in many ways, this talk is kind of the input of 10 years of thinking and learning and studying and bringing together a lot of ideas and a lot of kind of thinking and learning about what is required to make change in the world. And as we started this, I don't think there's a better time to be meeting together, albeit virtually, to talk about what are some really big real world problems and what it takes to address them. So I also, following my time with TTS, I went to graduate school and studied international education with a focus on human rights education. And then while I was teaching at New York University after graduating, I was working as a human rights practitioner. So I was doing research and advocacy and campaigning around several different human rights issues. And I think much of what we'll discuss today arose from that. So looking at the difference between human rights education and human rights practice, and how change comes and where change comes from. So just to kind of give you a really broad overview of the session, I'm going to go to a PowerPoint shortly. I don't love PowerPoints, but I also think it kind of gives us just a little bit of a guiding framework as we move along. This is like a 50,000 foot overview of human rights education, and human rights practice. So we're going to do that 50,000 foot overview for the first 10, 15 minutes, and then we're going to sprint into breakout groups and put into practice some of what we talked about. And then we're going to have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for discussion. And really want this to be a space to talk about and work through big issues that anybody might be grappling with right now, recognizing that there's a lot of things happening in the world, within the United States and globally, that's hard stuff. I have a hard time when I look at my newsfeed every day, trying to wrap my head around what's going on out there. So I think this, and hope this is a space where we can really kind of address some of those things in the limited time that we have together. So I'm going to do a screen share and get us going. Can everybody, my PowerPoint is up, perfect, okay. So before we launch into the 50,000 foot overview, we want to give everybody just a few minutes to jot down a couple thoughts. If you could think through them, jot them down, related to change and related to what you learned in formal education about making change. So we have 3 questions that we want to ask you. And the first question is, what is one issue that you are currently grappling with that you would want to change? And this could be taking place in your local community, nationally, or internationally. The second question is, what knowledge and skills did you learn in formal school, in any class? It might be social studies, it might be history. It could be math and science. It could be global studies. It could be a specific class dedicated to human rights education. But what knowledge and skills did you learn in your formal schooling that help prepare you to address this issue? And then finally, can you identify right now some gaps in your knowledge or skill set that you think are necessary to take action, but you don't yet have? And we'll just take a few minutes, and we won't share them now, you'll come back to them later. Maybe one more minute. Okay. We'll go ahead and jot down any final thoughts you have and kind of keep those handy because we'll come back to them. So, human rights. Gabby mentioned that we taught this course together, human rights. In a lot of ways, they are the backdrop, kind of set the tone or set the scene for a lot of the current collective mobilization and action that we're seeing taking place throughout the world, throughout various cities in the United States. But what are they? So at their very broadest, human rights are an internationally agreed upon set of rights or principles, and they apply to all people. And they're articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're not legally binding. They emerged from the Second World War. A group of thinkers from multiple countries came together and said that these guiding principles includes the right to education, the right to assembly, the right to live and work peaceably. These principles are what are required to bring about a new and more peaceful world. And they're the basis on which claims for change are made. Many of these rights have been included in domestic constitutions, and then there's subsequent laws that have been passed to try and codify these rights. But universal human rights kind of they get a bad rap sometimes. They're either not universal in terms of one type of critique, or they don't do enough to remedy a lot of the injustices and abuses that we hear about in the world. But ultimately, even though we can talk a lot about their shortcomings, a lot of the basis on which claims for change are made rest upon human rights. You can identify what is wrong with the world because rights give us an image or something to reach for about what we want to see in the world that is better than what we currently have. What about human rights education? So the idea behind having human rights is that people need to know them. They need to know what they are. They need to know how to activate them. And so shortly following the articulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was this idea that human rights education would be incorporated in curriculum throughout the world, and that it would be the new civics education for a new world. And there's a handful of aims that we have put here that are lofty and aspirational, but I think give a sense of how much idealism is wrapped up in the notion of human rights. So the aims of human rights education are strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, fully developing the human personality and the human sense of dignity, promoting understanding, tolerance, gender equality, and friendship among nations, indigenous people, and racial, national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups, enabling all people to participate effectively in a free society, and furthering activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. And again, if we just kind of think about those, they're huge, right? Like if we were to realize in part any of those, that would be a very different world in many ways than we live in. But if we could also imagine that prior to less than 100 years ago, these notions didn't really exist as they are. So it was radical at the time, and in many ways it's still radical, even though we've been doing this work for almost 80 years. So even though I said that we can critique human rights for a lot, it also enables a lot. I think there's some limits and shortcomings to human rights education that are important to talk about here. And ultimately, it's that at the end of the day, most of human rights education is bound up in this idea that knowledge of rights prevents rights violations and helps make change. But there's a lot more knowledge and skills that are required to do human rights work that human rights education doesn't necessarily allow us to address. So I'm going to turn it over to Gabby to give some examples of some of her own experiences with human rights education that help exemplify these concepts.
Thanks. And I think one thing that's super important to talk about with human rights education is that we can talk about it in an explicit way, or we can talk about it in an implicit way, because I mean, with these 5 pillars and with these 5 aims that human rights education sets up for any kind of class, or sets up for any kind of educational program, there are lots of ways of that this could be executed. You could look at more explicit titles and explicit programs in development in places like Argentina. In Argentina, from 1976 to 1983, the country went through a military dictatorship. It's a period known as the Dirty Wars, and there were dozens of human rights abuses in those cases, and people were disappearing off the streets. And ultimately, 2 of the major abuses that were happening in that period were the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly, because people, if they were against if they were against the ideology of the dictatorship, then they were subject to being kidnapped by the government. But after that period ended and the dictatorship was thrown out, the government worked really hard to think about what are we going to do to not actually have this ever happen again, and to actually educate our public about what our rights are and what we need to do to actually use our voices. And through that, there are larger institutions such as the Inter-American Institute for Human Rights that actually talks about human rights policy and human rights education and how to activate that, versus other NGOs throughout the country that try to educate people on more of a grassroots level, or it's embedded into social studies education. It was actually really interesting when I was in Buenos Aires in this past October, and I actually saw a high school taking a tour of a human rights, oh my gosh, how do I describe it? It was a detainment camp located in Buenos Aires, but the idea was that they were revisiting that history, and they were having conversations about what it meant to know your rights and to understand this history, so they could actually make sure that they would never experience something like that again. And that was really powerful to see that that was the approach that the teachers were taking, and that the students were having real conversations about that. In an implicit way, you could actually talk about, and even though we didn't get the chance to talk explicitly about human rights at my time at the traveling school, I would say that the Global Studies program, as a growing program, also has examples of human rights education. The way that we sit in circles and have discussions with each other, and everybody's voice is welcome, and we want you to critically think about the different levels of how you can make change, and you're recognizing what is going on and what you're recognizing what's going on in the world. In the spring of 2018, I was a co-teacher with the Changemaker curriculum with Caroline Goodman. And the idea is that we wanted to instill students to think about how they could take the knowledge that they had seen on this program, or the experiences that they had, and bring change back to their community. So the idea was to have them bridge that skill set and bridge that knowledge back to the United States, so they could really spread the word about the things that they had done on the program. And then interestingly enough, I think even though it wasn't an implicit way, and it's not really built into even Bolivia's curriculum, on the spring semester of 2018, we were witness to major protests in Sucre, and that is part of what I really came to learn about, that's really a part of that really happens amongst the Bolivian culture, that coming together and protesting for your rights, and they were recognizing that's an abuse of their government when they were fighting for that land recognition, and they were fighting back for that land in Kawasi. And even in that sense, it's like people didn't know, it wasn't talked about that it was human rights education, but it was talking about that we are standing up for ourselves, and we're going to use our voices, and we're going to congregate together in order to combat this. So there are lots of really cool examples about how human rights education is actually executed in the world. And it's still a growing process as we continue to challenge civics education frameworks. Chrissy?
Perfect. It's a perfect cue up. So I think one of the questions is, as human rights educators, particularly more critically minded human rights educators, are we trying to kind of shape and develop like sign wielding protesters who are ready to take to the streets? you know, and I think different people have different answers to that question. I think for me, and I think we talked about this a lot, Gabby, when we were teaching this course together, and it certainly came up in subsequent semesters, there's a lot of different ways to do human rights practice that I think are important to incorporate into formal classroom spaces. That some, you know, like protest and popular mobilization is a really important tool, but there's many other tools in the human rights practice toolkit that students and interested parties of all ages should know about. So we're going to go over some of those now, and that's going to set the stage for the second half of this workshop, is taking those issues and ideas that you identified in our little warm-up, and then utilizing the framework that we're about to talk about, and thinking about how you can use that framework to tackle and address the issue that you identified. So, knowledge and skills for collective action. This framework came directly from a human rights organization called Crisis Action, which is a behind-the-scenes convener of human rights and humanitarian organizations throughout the world. You can think of them as the invisible hand or a puppet master, but essentially the idea is to get human rights and humanitarian organizations on the same page so that they're speaking publicly, sometimes privately, collectively with one voice, and undertaking action that is capable of bringing about change in times of armed conflict. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But critical to any of the work that Crisis Action and then its more public-facing human rights and humanitarian partners do, and those partners, for example, could include Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, like the kind of foremost facing human rights and humanitarian organizations, is a power analysis. So before any action is taken, these are the 4 critical questions that need to be asked and answered. What is the specific change that we want to see? Who has the power to make the change? Who is the decision maker? Often, this is somebody who has a fair degree of power. It could be a mayor, a governor, a president, the head of an army, the head of a school, but like big, bold, like we want to try and influence Donald Trump. We want to try and influence Putin. We want to try and influence Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Like really identify who is the key decision maker, and then you can kind of move down to deputies and vice presidents and others who also have decision-making ability, but you want to think really big and bold. Who or what can persuade the person with power to make the change? So who does Donald Trump care about? Whose voices does he listen to? When we were coming up with some of these campaign tactics, we threw around all sorts of ideas. It could be Ivanka Trump. It could be Melania. It could be the Christian right. It could be, I don't know why I keep going back to Donald Trump. It's just like, that's kind of the biggest, boldest kind of target that we ever thought about. So it's sort of a useful one to reference in this context. But really, like, who do they listen to? Can you get the ear of the person they listen to? And then that leads us to the 4th question. What are the best tactics that can put pressure on the decision maker? So if your target decision maker cares about re-election, how do you get their voting public to care about their issue and to articulate that issue to the decision maker? So there's some tactics that are involved in this. Ultimately, the question and the statement that you want to use these 4 questions to help you come up with is, your goal will happen if decision maker takes a particular action that brings about the change you want to see, and that decision maker will be persuaded to do this by this tactic. And I'll give you an example as we move on to the next slide. So if you look at the bottom, as an example, South Sudan, a campaign that Crisis Action worked on, was the Free Peter Byer campaign. Peter Byer was and is a very outspoken youth advocate for South Sudan. He established the South Sudan Youth Freedom Forum, which spoke out about what they wanted to see from the newly established government of South Sudan. He did that work for almost a decade. He happens to be a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge, so he had a lot of expertise and clout and was very well regarded in South Sudan as well as the East African community. Peter Byer was jailed in 2018 by the government of South Sudan. Trumped up charges about disturbing the peace, laws that didn't even really exist on the books. But they detained him for almost 18 months. So when he was detained, the Free Peter Byer campaign was mobilized. So what did that look like? Well, the goal of the campaign was this. It was to release Peter Byer. And what we worked on was Peter Byer will be released if President Kiir, president of South Sudan, pardons him. And President Kiir will be persuaded to pardon Peter Byer if the United States government leverages future development funding and makes some of that funding contingent upon releasing Peter Byer. Lofty, bold, ambitious, right? What are some of the tactics that can be utilized to do this? Media campaign is something that happens often. So this can be op-eds, it can be newspaper ads, it can be billboard ads, Twitter campaigns, change.org campaigns, people can sign on, but trying to spread the word about the issue that you want to make change to. You can conduct research. You can get an expert in the field to compile a report that makes a case for, in this case, why Peter Byer needs to be released. Or you can do a documentary, a short doc, or you can get the media to investigate this and do a doc for you. You can do direct advocacy. You can take concerned parties and ask for meetings where you can make your case to interested parties. So in this case, we held a lot of meetings with the US government and with South Sudanese ambassadors and with ambassadors for South Sudan. And you could also do popular demonstrations, which are the most kind of highly visible example of what your case, the case you're trying to make. So you can mobilize protests. You can do a letter writing campaign. Often these tactics are not done independently of one another. They often go hand in hand. The example I've given you again is, it takes an organization to do this, but I think oftentimes when you're working at a smaller scale, you can take a group of concerned individuals and still make this happen very much on a local level. And again, if we go back to those questions, what is the goal? Who are the decision makers? What do they care about? What's going to get their attention? This applies on all levels, local, national, international, regardless of the level of resources, particularly financially, that you have. I want to talk a little bit about this notion of coalitions, because this goes in with collective action. Rarely anyone is acting alone to bring about any type of change. There's other people that care about the same issue. They have their own knowledge and expertise and resources. So you want to get those people together. They might be individuals, they might be businesses, they might be different, they might be teachers, they might be students. But people generally tend to care about an issue, especially if you show them that it's worth caring about. But I think it's worth noting two things. Often if you get a lot of people talking about an issue, coming up with what's the goal, who's the decision maker, et cetera, gets really challenging. And sometimes the goal becomes one around consensus. You try to find consensus about what that goal is. And I would caution you against that, because big, bold ideas, often you're not able to reach consensus over them. But what you want is to get enough people to commit to that goal and that idea, and give people the chance to opt into it rather than giving people the chance to opt out of it. And we can talk a lot more about that after the breakout session and discussion. And we already talked about the free beater buyer campaign. So again, 50,000 foot overview, lots of ideas that we just threw at you for the past 15 or so minutes. I'm going to turn it over to Gabby to set up our breakout activity.
Because in true TTS fashion, we are going to be doing an activity. Anyway, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting you all into small groups, and y'all are going to share those ideas that you came up with in the warm out, that social issue that is really grappling you in that moment, and where are your knowledge and skill sets now, and what are the next steps in those skills and knowledge, or yeah, skill set and knowledge. And as a group, y'all will choose one issue to focus on, and then answer the 4 questions that you reviewed in the recollective action, and develop your change theory. Like, what are you going to do to create change? And then, of course, if you have time, we can do them more than one issue. But we'll break out for about 10 minutes. Y'all will break out at 10 minutes or so. Feel free also, if you're comfortable, to turn on your cameras if your cameras haven't been on at this point, so everybody can see all of your beautiful faces, of course. And so then we'll come back together, and we'll be able to talk about what those conversations are like, and where we can actually start thinking about how to make change. So I'm going to start doing breakout rooms.
We'll go ahead and post those questions into the chat so you can have them as you move along. Yep.
A ver. Did that work? Oh, there it goes.
Guys, we were just talking, we're like, we just miss the traveling school so much after discussions like this. Like,
Ruby said she wants to be on a semester with all of you, so.
Let's go. Fun.
Also, hi, Anna. You and I looked up.
Oh my God, and Becca from Ruby's here. Oh my God, this is so absolutely amazing.
It's so cool
Okay.
to see all you
And
people.
Sarah? Wow, wow, wow.
So
Hi.
awesome.
This is good for the heart right here. So before we start the session, I meant to mention when I was talking about Peter Byer that he was jailed for 18 months, but he was released. He was released earlier this year after a sustained campaign where effectively the president of South Sudan was pressured. He felt like he couldn't keep Peter Byer in jail and have people not notice. And there was enough people in the US government who basically said to him, this is not just going to go quietly into the night and that there will be consequences financially. So I just say that to kind of give a positive example of change. Change does happen. These things do work. He's now in the United States and has his family with him. So anyway, with that example kind of put out there, really free flow discussion, throwing big questions out there. Obviously, they are big questions, so there's not easy answers. We just did a little session, Gaby and I, and the TTS office staff, where we talked about issues and we also talked about some of the challenges, like how do you, what does it mean to be big and bold? What does it mean to actually look at this at a local level? Like, how do you even get started? So I'll just kind of put all that out there and say we're really looking forward to using this last 10 minutes to kind of put certainties and uncertainties out on the table, probably more uncertainties than certainties. But let's see, how do we want to do this? We should have talked about this. Do we want to raise hands and we'll answer them? Or if I'm in a classroom space, I just have people talk out. I think that's a little harder on Zoom, but we can give that a whirl too.
I was gonna say,
Gaby?
isn't there a little icon that people can?
Yeah, you can raise your hand. You know what? Let's just experiment online with my preferred method. And we're just gonna say people unmute themselves and don't be shy. And if there's two people that talking at once, we can work that out.
We're not afraid of silence either.
I was just gonna say, Jennifer, I'm like not afraid of silence, so I can just wait for a moment.
Okay, since time is of the essence, we're just gonna move right along.
Yeah, Becca.
Our group had a lot of big sweeping issues, and we kind of tried to trace it back to, or I definitely pushed to trace it back to voting, turnout, election, and then we got more specific to fighting voter suppression.
Yeah.
And how that's connected to a lot of issues. We didn't get too far. We identified who we'd go to on a local level. We thought, it's obviously an issue local through federal, but we thought it's more effective to focus on local, and that's as far as we got.
Awesome. Can I ask, on a local level, what are some of the things you guys discussed in terms of working to combat voter suppression?
Pass that off to anyone else in my group.
Anybody else? Awesome.
Okay, I'll speak. Hi, it's Sarah. We were basically just talking about maybe like the state representatives, mayors, who else? I'm drawing a blank. Someone jump in because I had it. Yeah, just the city council, like just people like that who will listen to, I guess I don't want to say the little people because they're not the little people, but they'll take our our voices into consideration and then implement it as long as we're serious and passionate about what it is that we want.
Absolutely, because what do they care about? Re-election, right?
Yeah.
Like, people want to be re-elected. They want people they want people to pick up the phone and express their concerns to them, because they know that if somebody cares enough to pick up the phone and express a concern, that's probably somebody who's going to vote. And they're going to take that into consideration when they think about how they act or how they don't act. So I don't think it's not a small thing at all. I think it's I think it's a key tactic, to pick up the phone and call, get 10 people you know to pick up the phone and call. Like, if you get 10 people you know to pick up the phone and call a representative, that's huge. Like, it's elected representatives' jobs to listen to their constituents. And I think that's often kind of glossed over or forgotten, but I think that's great. How about other groups?
Can I just say, I agree with you, Chrissy, and I'm so pumped that you came to the vote and voter suppression, because in our group we were too big too. It's so big it's overwhelming, and boom, 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 boom. And mine had to do with voting, getting people to vote. And I think that it's not real glamorous to write letters and write emails to these people. I mean, we have these people in our state that I just don't like. I get tired, but it's like that is really a thing we can do. So it's not real glamorous, but it definitely, especially if you bring people in, it has impact.
Can I just jump on too and say that human rights work is seldom glamorous. And truly, I think that's so important, because you have this idea of like super aspirational goals, and you see the United Nations and you think about these NGOs, and it's like, no, it's just people in the trenches who care. Most of them are sitting in very mundane offices, typing emails and making phone calls late into the night. That is human rights work. And occasionally you make this victory where you're like, yeah, so-and-so was threatening to move voting lines or keep a polling place closed. And we got 10 people to call, and lo and behold, that polling place is going to remain open. That's a victory. That's awesome. And I think that's really important to think along those lines. Other questions, other kind of stumbling blocks or kind of issues that came up in the breakout sessions, things that are helpful to talk about here.
Our group decided to tackle the world and deal with racism and treating people equally. Awesome. We're all in agreement, and not to be colorblind, but to celebrate differences without discriminating for those differences. But one of the challenges that several of us talked about is it's not enough to think that you grew up not in a racist home or a racist town, or you have to be actively anti-racist. You have to be actively reteaching yourself what has happened, because just thinking, I don't hate people who look different than me, that's not going to tackle it. But one of the big challenges that we discussed is white men in power. 44 of 45 presidents have been white men. So how do we convince white men of the changes that we got stuck there?
This is key, right? So if we were to, sometimes you can't. I don't know that you can, I don't know that you can make Mike Pence or Donald Trump necessarily think differently. Is it an aspect, is it a worthwhile goal, and would it help address some of what we're talking about if there was a concerted effort to prevent Donald Trump from tweeting? That's not an illegitimate campaign proposition. And we could kind of run through the activity to think about what, we won't here because we don't have time, but that's, I would say that's, like I said, that's not an unrealizable necessarily campaign proposition, or kind of an illogical campaign proposition. But I would say then the other side of that is, can you rally around and support people of, non-white men to run for office? And there's been a lot of movement around, so if you can't influence the decision makers, can you encourage people to vote differently? Like, and can you mobilize and rally people around something positive, vote for that person, rather than try and prevent somebody from doing something? So I think that's another way of kind of looking at that, potentially, on different scales, local, national, international. I just want to kind of do a check with the office in terms of how we feel about, I mean, with everybody in the call, but particularly the office, in terms of how they feel about time and
I want
Well,
this done forever.
I was gonna say, it's gonna be hard to change the world in 1 hour, so
It
it's
is, I
gonna be
know.
hard to make this end.
Well, do you want to talk for 2 or 3 more minutes and then kind of wrap up and see if there's, you know,
Is that all right with everyone?
And if yeah, obviously if anybody needs to leave
That's
the
why
call.
we're here. We're just gonna do more of this stuff, people.
Yeah. Great. I would encourage somebody to use the last 2 or 3 minutes to throw out a big idea or question, because it's always helpful, I think, to end on a big idea or question, because big questions are really important.
I actually, you said something that kind of jumped out at me. When you were mentioning, you were saying, how do you get, I guess you said white men to listen to us or trying to change their mind. I thought that was very interesting, because it was, and just how I saw it, it was said in a way of where it was like, we need permission. And I think in a lot of times in society, especially women, we kind of maneuver in a way in which we feel like we need permission or in order to access something, instead of just grabbing it for ourselves. And one of the questions that I had in my mind when I was said, it was like, well, how do we grab that for ourselves unapologetically? And what does that look like? And what does that sound like? And is it, I don't think it's wrong, but how wrong will society view that if you're just grabbing it? You know what I mean? Like, how uncomfortable is that? Is that even uncomfortable for us? You know what I mean? Like, racially, there are different viewpoints. And then me personally, like as a Black woman, to hear that coming from a white woman, it was, I don't want to say shocking, but it was like, oh wow, okay, because there's a view upon which, this is how I saw it, at least, that you were not acknowledged. And me, I feel like just in a societally, people of color are not acknowledged in a lot of different ways. So to see that there's a viewpoint upon which you're like, I'm not being heard, or we're not being heard, how do you feel? And there's another viewpoint of where it was saying in the media, a lot, it was being pushed that a lot of white women had pushed and voted for Trump, which is why he had won. So, and I guess so 4 years later, how is that viewpoint and how is that image, I guess, being changed, and how, what is the initiative that is made, or how do you basically say, I'm here and this is my voice and I don't like what's happening or what's going on and I want to change that, you know, like how, as women. So I don't know, that just kind of popped into my mind. And
you know,
yeah, I don't know if I just ruffled feathers. That I don't know, I'm sorry.
I think the context we talked about that was, yes, historically we felt like, you know, it was dependent on white men to make decisions and give other groups the permission to do things they wanted to do, women to vote, all those kinds of things. But in the context of today and the way we were talking about racism, it was more like, they're kind of the biggest obstacle, or they're kind of the biggest group that we have to pull along. It wasn't really within the kind of the permission realm. So I think we're beyond that. Do you guys feel that way, that it wasn't necessarily that we needed their permission? It was more that it was that they're kind of the biggest obstacle. Generally speaking, we weren't trying to be very, you know.
I mean, no, yes. I think this is a big, huge one to kind of wrap up with, right? So it's going to leave a lot open, which is perfect. I think there's, again, like oftentimes it's going to feel uncomfortable, right? Like, what does it mean to be the person in the room that's being loud, that's speaking out against others, that's the person around the family dinner table that's like, yeah, no, like, no, or the person at a dinner party and like, no. And it's like, you feel very conspicuous and you feel the spotlight on you. And I think there's a lot to be said around like, how do you think through some tactics for doing that so that you're calm, clear, rational, like, you know, but also there's a lot to be said for like being very like upset and letting your emotions fly free, because I think that also makes a point. But, you know, all of that is kind of dependent upon specific situations. But I think challenging ourselves to be uncomfortable and challenging ourselves to make other people uncomfortable and to challenge their beliefs and their assumptions is also kind of so critical to everything that we're talking about and to making any kind of change, because there's a reason that change hasn't happened, right? Like it's deep-seated, it's inherent, people don't talk about it, but like we need to draw it out and we need to talk about it more. And
there's a great book that I just read called White Fragility, and it's about white people just having such a difficult time talking about race. And it was so good. And it talks about the tools that, you know, you can start to build in your own life and the way you approach things to help along that journey.
Awesome. There's so many resources that I think, you know, we have been, maybe if it's okay with the office, we'll share just a few resources for human rights education, the framework that we were using for crisis action, in terms of kind of mobilizing for change that might be helpful. Because I think sharing resources is so critical and important too. So I want to make sure we can share those. Thank you so much to everyone. It has been a true privilege to be able to be with you all tonight and to see so many faces. And I wish we had more time, but we'll just have to participate in other lectures and hope I see you again. Yeah. Gabby, anything before we close out?
No, I love feeling the spirit of I love feeling the spirit of agency and the spirit of feeling empowered and not feeling defeated in a moment like this, because I think a big theme of what we have been talking about is that it is a really daunting thing. It is a really huge thing to like come into this space and to be the black sheep, to be the person that says no, to be this person that says that this isn't right, and then to understand what kind of ripple effects that is. But I feel more empowered, and I hope to share that empowerment with. I hope that we can share that empowerment with all of you, whether it's like through these resources or continuing these conversations about what it does really mean to make what it really does to make change, because everybody in their own way can and is a change maker, especially like especially with that language that we use here at the traveling school, that at least like we've used more recently at the traveling school. And what does that really mean, and how far can you go, and how far can you go with that change? And so spreading that and sharing whatever your actions are, it feels powerful. So it's a continuous path. Like it's not necessarily like every single action, but it's like a string of like what happens on a daily basis.
Well, I'll chime in here briefly and just say thank you, ladies, so much for your time. This series for me feels like this blatant silver lining of our programming being halted right now. And we really deeply admire and appreciate these two passionate women for sharing both their passion and their expertise with us this evening. I hope you all shared in that experience that I know I'm feeling right now of just learning a ton and really reveling in the talent and wisdom across this entire community. So thank you for showing up, and thank you for participating and for your commitment to learning right now and learning about the tough stuff and the stuff that we should be talking about. So this series, which I'm excited, this is just the first one of 7. So we've got these big topics and ideas swirling around right now, and we have different topics to come across the next 6 weeks, but I think this conversation is just giving us some more ripe fodder for what kinds of things we're excited to continue talking about. And these lovely ladies have donated their time tonight and all of the time that they've put into preparing this lesson so that we can learn together and create some excitement around contributing to our financial aid fund, and just this greater idea of learning together in this new techie space. So if you haven't already, and if you are able and willing right now, any donation to that financial aid fund would be so much appreciated. And if you're not able to donate right now, that's okay too. Keep supporting us through your participation in these series down the line. We've got 6 more to go, and I imagine they'll all be juicy conversations like the one we had tonight. So stay tuned, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, shoot us an email if you're not on those platforms and want more information, because we've got more coming. And yeah, we just appreciate you so much. And I know I've learned a ton from all of you, and especially Gaby and Chrissie. So thank you. Thank you for joining. And Jennifer, do you have any last words before we?
Yeah, I was just, of course I do. I was, sorry. I was just going to say, we're going to survey you because we want to keep doing this, and we have 7. I mean, but we could have had 17 or 25. And we want, there's a lot of teachers, there's a lot of students who are doing amazing things. There's a lot of parents, board members, community people. So, and we are interested in continuing to think bigger even about, like, let's have a topic that we spend 4 sessions on and really dig in and bring in some experts that that aren't traveling school too. So like just continuing to move this along and just keep pushing ourselves to learn and think and learn from each other. So we're going to survey you, and you get surveyed all the time, but we would love to hear from you about what are you interested in? And we're so psyched that you're here. So thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, and on that note, in the chat, I just put briefly, if you have the capacity right now to just put your contact information into our conversation, we can make sure that any resources Chrissie and Gaby send our way, we can get to you, in addition to keeping you in the loop about series down the line. The registration form that you filled out likely to get the Zoom link for this is the same for all of the events. So if you didn't let us know that you're planning on coming to others, it's not the end of the world at all, but we do like to communicate to faculty a general idea of numbers. So definitely just keep spreading the word about that registration, and we'll get you that survey as well to have feedback implemented across the rest of the series.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.